The gas station was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you notice the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Two women, both in their late 20s, stood by their car, filling up the tank. They were laughing about something, the kind of easy laughter that comes from a long friendship. One of them adjusted her scarf, the other checked her phone. It was an ordinary evening, until it wasn't. The roar of motorcycle engines shattered the calm. Three bikers pulled into the station, their bikes gleaming under the harsh lights. They were loud, their voices carrying across the lot as they joked with each other. At first, the women didn't pay them much attention. But then, one of the bikers noticed them. "Hey, you two," he called out, his voice dripping with mockery. The women exchanged a glance but didn't respond. They'd been through this before, ignoring it was usually the best option. But the biker wasn't done. He revved his engine, the sound echoing like a threat, and his friends laughed. "You deaf or something?" another biker shouted, his tone sharper now. The women froze. One of them, the taller of the two, stepped forward slightly, shielding her friend. "We're just here to get gas," she said, her voice steady but firm. The bikers didn't like that. They dismounted their bikes, their boots hitting the pavement with deliberate heaviness. The leader, a burly man with a beard, walked up to them, his face twisted into a sneer. "You think you're too good to talk to us?" he spat, his breath reeking of alcohol. The women backed up, their fear palpable. The shorter one clutched her friend's arm, her eyes darting around for help. But the gas station was nearly empty, just an elderly man pumping gas a few feet away and a cashier inside who seemed oblivious to the scene unfolding outside. The bikers circled them now, their taunts growing uglier. "You don't belong here," one of them said, his voice low and venomous. The taller woman tried to reason with them, her voice trembling but still strong. "Please, just leave us alone. We're not looking for trouble." But the bikers weren't listening. They were enjoying this, feeding off the women's fear. The leader reached out, grabbing the taller woman's arm. She jerked back, but his grip was like iron. "Let go of me," she shouted, her voice breaking. It was at that moment that the elderly man by the pumps turned around. He had been watching silently, his face unreadable. But now, he moved with a purpose that belied his age. His steps were deliberate, his posture straight. He didn't say a word, but his presence was enough to make the bikers pause. "What's your problem, old man?" the leader barked, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his voice. The man didn't flinch. He simply stood there, his eyes locked on the bikers, his silence more powerful than any words. The tension in the air was electric. The women held their breath, unsure of what would happen next. The bikers, caught off guard by the man's calm defiance, hesitated. And in that moment of hesitation, something shifted. The sound of a car pulling into the station broke the silence. The bikers glanced at each other, their bravado wavering. The leader finally let go of the woman's arm, muttering something under his breath. But it wasn't over, not yet. The elderly man stepped closer, his voice quiet but firm. "You boys need to leave," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The bikers glared at him, but they didn't move. The women, still shaken, watched in disbelief as the scene unfolded. And then, the unexpected happened. The bikers hesitated, their bravado faltering under the steady gaze of the elderly man. He wasn't tall or imposing, but there was something about him, a quiet strength that made the bikers think twice. The leader, still gripping the taller woman's arm, sneered but didn't move. "This doesn't concern you, old man," he growled, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. The man didn't blink. "It does now," he said simply. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a warning that even the bikers couldn't ignore. The taller woman took advantage of the momentary distraction and pulled her arm free, stepping back to stand beside her friend. Both women were visibly shaken, but they felt a glimmer of hope as the man positioned himself between them and the bikers. The leader of the bikers, clearly not used to being challenged, took a step forward, his face red with anger. "You think you're some kind of hero?" he spat, his fists clenched. But the man didn't flinch. He stood his ground, his eyes never leaving the bikers. "I'm just a man who knows right from wrong," the man replied. His voice was steady, but there was a weight to his words, a lifetime of experience behind them. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances. They were used to intimidating people, but this man was different. He wasn't afraid of them. The shorter woman, still clutching her friend's arm, whispered, "Thank you." The man gave her a brief nod but kept his focus on the bikers. "You boys need to walk away," he said again, his tone firm but not aggressive. "This isn't the way." For a moment, it seemed like the bikers might listen. The leader took a step back, his fists unclenching slightly. But then, one of the other bikers, a younger man with a sneer plastered across his face, stepped forward. "We're not going anywhere," he said, his voice dripping with defiance. "Who do you think you are, telling us what to do?" The man sighed, as if he'd seen this kind of behavior 100 times before. "I'm someone who's seen enough pain to know it doesn't solve anything," he said. His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The younger biker faltered, his sneer fading slightly. The leader, sensing his group's hesitation, tried to rally them. "Come on, we're not scared of some old guy," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. He took another step forward, but the man didn't back down. Instead, he did something unexpected. He smiled. It wasn't a mocking smile or a cruel one. It was the kind of smile that said he understood something they didn't. "You think this makes you strong?" he asked, his voice soft but carrying. "Bullying people who can't defend themselves? That's not strength. That's fear." The words hit like a punch. The bikers froze, their bravado crumbling under the weight of the man's quiet authority. The leader opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. For the first time, he looked unsure, even ashamed. The taller woman, emboldened by the man's courage, spoke up. "We didn't do anything to you," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "Why are you doing this?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. The bikers shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her gaze. The man took a step forward, his presence commanding but not threatening. "It's not too late to walk away," he said. "To do the right thing." The younger biker, the one who had been so defiant moments ago, looked down at his boots. "Maybe we should just go," he muttered, his voice barely audible. The leader shot him a glare, but even he seemed to be losing steam. Just then, the sound of a car door slamming shut broke the tension. A middle-aged man, who had been filling up his truck nearby, walked over. "Everything okay here?" he asked, his voice loud and confident. The bikers, now outnumbered and unsure, took a step back. The leader muttered something under his breath, then turned to his friends. "Let's get out of here," he said, his voice low but laced with frustration. The bikers mounted their bikes, their earlier swagger replaced by a sense of defeat. As they roared out of the gas station, the women let out a breath they didn't realize they'd been holding. The taller woman turned to the elderly man, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in." The man shook his head. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "I just did what anyone should do." But the women knew it wasn't that simple. In a world where so many people looked the other way, this man had chosen to stand up. And in doing so, he had changed everything. The gas station felt eerily quiet after the bikers left, the roar of their engines fading into the distance. The two women stood there, still shaken but grateful for the elderly man's intervention. The taller one wiped a tear from her cheek, her hands trembling as she tried to steady her breathing. Her friend, the shorter one, clung to her arm, her face pale but relieved. The elderly man turned to them, his expression softening. "Are you two all right?" he asked. His voice gentle now, a stark contrast to the firm tone he'd used with the bikers. The taller woman nodded, though her eyes were still wide with fear. "We're okay," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thanks to you." The man gave a small, humble smile. "I'm just glad I was here," he said. He glanced around the gas station, his eyes scanning the area as if making sure the bikers were truly gone. The middle-aged man who had stepped in earlier approached, his face filled with concern. "Do you need me to call the police?" he asked, pulling out his phone. The taller woman hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, please," she said. "I think we should report this. Who knows what they might do next?" As the middle-aged man dialed the number, the elderly man turned back to the women. "You did the right thing," he said. "People like that need to be held accountable." His voice carried a weight of experience, as if he'd seen too much of the world's ugliness but still believed in doing what was right. The shorter woman, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "Why did they do that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We weren't doing anything wrong. We were just here." The man sighed, his expression thoughtful. "Sometimes," he said, "people act out of fear or ignorance. They see someone different, and instead of trying to understand, they lash out. It's not about you. It's about them." His words resonated with the women, and they nodded slowly, taking in what he was saying. The taller woman wiped her eyes again, her voice stronger now. It's exhausting," she said. "Dealing with this kind of thing all the time. You never know when it's going to happen." The man nodded, his eyes filled with empathy. "I know," he said. "And I'm sorry you have to go through that. But what you did today, standing your ground, staying calm, that takes real strength." The women exchanged a glance, a small smile forming on the taller one's face. "Thank you," she said again. "For everything." The sound of sirens in the distance broke the moment. The middle-aged man, who had been speaking to the police on the phone, walked over. "They're on their way," he said. "They'll want to take your statements." The women nodded, bracing themselves for what was to come. The elderly man stayed with them, offering quiet support as they waited. When the police arrived, they took down the details of the incident, asking questions and jotting notes. The women described the bikers as best they could, their voices steady but still tinged with emotion. As the officers wrapped up, one of them turned to the elderly man. "You were the one who stepped in?" he asked. The man nodded. "I just did what anyone should do," he said again, his humility shining through. The officer smiled. "Well, we could use more people like you," he said. "It's not easy to stand up to something like that." The man shrugged, as if it were nothing, but the women knew better. They knew how much courage it had taken for him to intervene, to put himself in harm's way for strangers. As the police left, the women turned to the man once more. "Is there any way we can thank you?" the taller woman asked. You saved us." The man shook his head. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "But if you want to do something, pay it forward. Help someone else when they need it. That's the best way to thank me." The women nodded, their eyes filled with determination. "We will," the shorter woman said, her voice firm now. "I promise." The man smiled, a warm, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Good," he said. "That's all I ask." As they prepared to leave, the taller woman hesitated. "Can I ask, what's your name?" she said. The man paused, then shook his head. "It doesn't matter," he said. "Just know that there are still good people out there. And you're two of them." With that, he turned and walked away, his figure disappearing into the night. The women stood there for a moment, watching him go, a sense of gratitude and hope filling their hearts. But as they got into their car and drove away, they couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of the story. Something about the way the bikers had left, the look in their eyes, told them that this wasn't over. And they were right. The night air was cool as the two women drove away from the gas station, the events of the evening replaying in their minds. The taller woman gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white, while her friend sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken thoughts and lingering fear. "Do you think they'll come back?" the shorter woman asked suddenly, her voice breaking the quiet. The taller woman hesitated, then shook her head. "I don't know," she admitted. But we did the right thing by reporting it. The police will handle it. Her friend nodded, but her face was still clouded with worry. I can't stop thinking about what could have happened if that man hadn't been there, she said softly. The taller woman reached over and squeezed her friend's hand. But he was there, she said firmly. And we're okay. We're strong. We'll get through this. Her words were meant to reassure, but both women knew the incident had left a mark. It wasn't just about the bikers or the confrontation, it was about the reminder that the world could be cruel, that kindness wasn't always a given. Meanwhile, the bikers were miles away, their bikes roaring down a deserted highway. The leader, still seething from the encounter, gripped the handlebars so tightly his hands ached. He couldn't shake the image of the elderly man standing there, calm and unyielding, or the way his own confidence had crumbled under that steady gaze. We should have handled that differently, one of the bikers muttered, his voice barely audible over the engine noise. The leader shot him a glare. What are you talking about? He snapped. The biker hesitated, then shrugged. I don't know. It just didn't feel right, you know? Those women weren't doing anything wrong. And that old guy, he wasn't scared of us. The leader didn't respond, but his jaw tightened. He didn't want to admit it, but the same thoughts had been nagging at him. He'd always prided himself on being tough, on not backing down from anyone. But tonight, something had felt off. When they finally pulled into the parking lot of a dimly lit bar, the leader killed the engine and sat there for a moment, staring at the ground. His friends dismounted their bikes, but he stayed put, lost in thought. You coming? One of the bikers called out. The leader shook his head. Not tonight, he said. I need some time to think. His friends exchanged uneasy glances but didn't argue. They headed inside, leaving him alone with his thoughts. Back at the gas station, the police were wrapping up their investigation. They'd taken statements from the women and the middle-aged man who had called them, and they'd reviewed the security footage. The bikers' faces were clear on the tape, and one of the officers recognized the leader. That's him, the officer said, pointing at the screen. He's been in trouble before, minor stuff, mostly. But this is different. The other officer nodded. We'll find them, he said. They can't hide for long. As the night wore on, the bikers' unease grew. The younger one, the one who had spoken up earlier, couldn't shake the feeling that they'd crossed a line. He sat at the bar, nursing a drink, his mind racing. You okay? One of his friends asked, clapping him on the back. The younger biker shook his head. Not really, he admitted. I keep thinking about what that old guy said. About how bullying people doesn't make you strong. It makes you weak. His friend frowned but didn't argue. Deep down, he knew the younger biker was right. The next morning, the police tracked down the bikers at the bar. They arrived just as the group was leaving, their bikes lined up in the parking lot. The leader froze when he saw the officers approaching, his heart pounding. We need to talk, one of the officers said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The bikers exchanged nervous glances but didn't resist. They were taken to the station, where they were questioned about the incident at the gas station. At first, the leader tried to downplay what had happened, but the security footage told a different story. As the reality of the situation sank in, the bikers began to crack. The younger one, unable to bear the weight of his guilt, broke down. I didn't want to do it, he said, his voice trembling. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I didn't know how to stop it. The officers listened, their expressions stern but not unkind. It's not too late to make things right, one of them said. But you need to take responsibility for what you did. The bikers nodded, their bravado gone. For the first time, they were forced to confront the consequences of their actions, and the pain they had caused. Meanwhile, the two women were trying to move on with their lives. They'd been shaken by the incident, but they refused to let it define them. They leaned on each other for support, their bond stronger than ever. A few days later, they received a call from the police. The bikers had been identified and charged, and the officers wanted to update them on the case. They're facing serious consequences, the officer said. But one of them, the younger one, wants to apologize. He asked if he could meet with you. The women were taken aback. They hadn't expected this. After a long discussion, they agreed to meet with the younger biker, curious to hear what he had to say. When the day came, they arrived at the police station, their nerves on edge. The younger biker was brought into the room, his head bowed. He looked up at them, his eyes filled with remorse. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry for what we did. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed to say it." The women exchanged a glance, then nodded. "Thank you," the taller woman said. "That means a lot." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. And in that moment, they all realized that the story wasn't over. It was just beginning. The meeting at the police station left a profound impact on everyone involved. For the two women, it was a step toward healing, a chance to see the humanity in someone who had caused them so much pain. For the younger biker, it was a moment of reckoning, a realization that his actions had consequences far beyond what he'd imagined. As the women left the station, they felt a mix of emotions, relief, sadness, and a glimmer of hope. The taller woman turned to her friend and said, "I never thought I'd hear an apology from one of them. It doesn't fix everything, but it's something." Her friend nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "It's a start," she agreed. "Maybe people can change." Meanwhile, the younger biker was left to grapple with his guilt. After the meeting, he was released on bail, but the weight of what he'd done followed him everywhere. He couldn't shake the image of the women's faces, their fear, their strength, their willingness to hear him out. He returned to the bar where his friends often gathered, but the atmosphere was different now. The leader of the group, still defiant but visibly shaken, sat in a corner, nursing a drink. The younger biker approached him, his heart pounding. "We need to talk," he said, his voice firm. The leader looked up, his eyes narrowing. "About what?" he growled. "About what we did," the younger biker replied. "About how we treated those women. It was wrong, and you know it." The leader slammed his glass down on the table, his face red with anger. "You think I don't know that?" he snapped. "You think I haven't been thinking about it every damn day?" The younger biker was taken aback by the outburst, but he stood his ground. "Then why don't we do something about it?" he asked. "Why don't we try to make it right?" The leader stared at him for a long moment, then sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I don't know how," he admitted, his voice quieter now. The younger biker sat down across from him, his expression earnest. "We start by taking responsibility," he said. "By owning up to what we did and trying to be better. It's not going to be easy, but it's the only way." The leader didn't respond right away, but the younger biker could see the conflict in his eyes. For the first time, he realized that the man he'd always seen as fearless was just as scared and lost as he was. Over the next few weeks, the bikers began to change. The younger one took the lead, encouraging his friends to reflect on their actions and the harm they'd caused. It wasn't easy, old habits and attitudes were hard to break, but slowly, they began to see things differently. The leader, in particular, struggled with the process. He'd spent so long building a tough exterior that letting it down felt like a betrayal of who he was. But as he listened to the younger biker's words and saw the sincerity in his eyes, he began to understand that true strength wasn't about intimidation or dominance. It was about courage, accountability, and the willingness to change. One evening, the bikers gathered at the bar again, but this time, the mood was different. The leader stood up, his hands trembling slightly, and addressed the group. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he began, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "About what happened at the gas station, about the choices we've made. And I realize now that we've been going about this all wrong. We thought we were tough, but all we were doing was hurting people, and ourselves." The room fell silent as the others listened, their expressions a mix of surprise and curiosity. "I'm not saying this to make excuses," the leader continued. I'm saying it because it's the truth. And if we want to be better, if we want to be the kind of people who deserve respect, we need to start by respecting others." The younger biker nodded, his eyes filled with pride. "We've got a long way to go," he said. "But we're on the right path." As the weeks turned into months, the bikers began to take steps to make amends. They reached out to the two women, offering sincere apologies and asking how they could help. The women, though still cautious, appreciated the effort and suggested they use their platform to spread awareness about the harm caused by prejudice and bullying. The bikers took the suggestion to heart. They started attending community events, speaking openly about their experiences and the lessons they'd learned. It wasn't easy, they faced skepticism and criticism, but they persisted, determined to make a difference. The two women, inspired by the bikers' transformation, began to share their own story. They spoke at schools and community centers, emphasizing the importance of standing up for what's right and the power of forgiveness. The elderly man who had intervened at the gas station remained a quiet but powerful presence in their lives. Though he never sought recognition, his actions continued to inspire everyone who heard the story. As the community came together, the incident at the gas station became a turning point, a reminder that even in the face of hatred and fear, there is always hope for change. Months had passed since the incident at the gas station, and the ripple effects of that night continued to spread. What had started as a moment of fear and confrontation had transformed into a story of redemption, growth, and hope. The two women, the bikers, and even the elderly man who had stepped in that night had all been changed in ways they never could have anticipated. The two women had become advocates for kindness and courage, sharing their story at community events and schools. They spoke about the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's hard, and the power of forgiveness. Their message resonated deeply, especially with young people who were struggling to find their place in the world. One evening, they were invited to speak at a local high school. The auditorium was packed, the air buzzing with anticipation. The taller woman stepped up to the podium, her friend standing beside her. "A few months ago," she began, her voice steady, "we were in a situation that could have ended very differently. We were scared, unsure of what to do. But because of one person's courage, because of his willingness to stand up for us, everything changed." She paused, letting her words sink in. "That night taught us something important, that even in the darkest moments, there is always hope. That one act of kindness, one moment of bravery, can change everything." Her friend stepped forward, adding, "We also learned that people can change. The men who hurt us that night have taken steps to make amends, to become better people. And while forgiveness isn't always easy, it's powerful. It allows us to move forward, to heal." The audience listened intently, their faces reflecting a mix of emotions. When the women finished speaking, the room erupted into applause. Afterward, several students approached them, thanking them for sharing their story and asking how they could make a difference in their own communities. Meanwhile, the bikers were on their own journey of transformation. The younger biker had